We've got some brilliant speakers with us tonight. But before I go into just saying a little bit about Claudia and why the Black Members Council believes that this is one of the most important things that the union can put on every year, let me give some thanks to people first. Sadia. She's the person with the money, basically. So we have to thank Sadia. It's done an immense amount of work to make sure this is off the ground. Other members of the Black Members Council are also in the room as well. But particularly, can I thank the Guardian Chapel? Because it was really important for us as a Black Members Council that we were able to come back to the Guardian and have this annual lecture. There's all sorts of reasons why we've not been back. I'm not going to go into, but it's really important for us that strong bond, that strong relationship is now back on, and I'm looking forward to continuing that relationship. So big thanks to the Guardian Chapel, please, everyone. I think I'll say a little bit about the speakers in a few moments, but I wanted to say something about Claudia Jones because there's lots of Black journalists in this room, and back in the day there weren't too many Black journalists around to look to and to say this is somebody who I could be like. But it's actually more than just having somebody who's like a kind of role model thing. You know, it's much more than that, because it wasn't just a kind of tokenistic thing with Claudia. She was a really good journalist, really good journalist. If you ever get a chance to have a look at some of the stuff that she wrote and the kind of context in which she wrote it, then please take that chance. She was the founding editor of the West Indian Gazette. And when you get a chance to have a look at some of the things that they were talking about and the reason why she was one of the founders, she wasn't the only founder, but one of the founders of the carnival, which later became the Notting Hill Carnival, then you'll understand why tonight is important. But let me give you a flavour of that. So she was responding when that first carnival was set up, actually just down the road, at St Pancras Town Hall, was the first carnival. When that carnival was first set up, it was in response to racist attacks that were taking place. Kelsa Cochrane, I think it was it? But others as well. And the particular event that I want to kind of talk about, which one of the catalysts was, there was a white woman who had the audacity to marry a Black man in 1959, and she had an argument with her husband in the street, but then some racists decided that it was their duty to not only beat her up, but also to beat him up, and then to go on the rampage around the area in West London. Doesn't this sound kind of familiar to what we're kind of experiencing again today? Because what we are facing now, which is really the theme of tonight, and why we wanted to attach this to learning about what Claudia Jones went through all those years ago, and what many Black people went through all those years ago, was what can we learn from that to help us to deal with the challenges that we face today, where again people are rampaging through communities, where people are cloaking themselves in flags. Now, if people want to be patriotic, I have no problem at all with that, if that's what people want to do. But I can tell you from my experience what it was like, where people draped themselves in flags and then came into our communities and attacked us, where they draped themselves in flags and then put letter bombs through our letterboxes, or dog mess through our letterboxes, petrol bombs and so on. This is the reality of what it was back then. And I'm just hearing all the time from so many people at the moment that they're faced with similar again. Now, you either kind of accept that, or you try and find a way of fighting back against that stuff. And what Claudia did all those years ago was one of her key weapons in the fight back was what she was able to write. And it wasn't just some kind of academic exercise. She was writing about those things to build a unity amongst the black community, but also a unity between black and white people, because frankly, we don't beat racism unless there is a unity between black and white people. Simple, right? And that's what she was able to write about. So when you look at the West Indian Gazette from all those years ago, you'll see that she was talking about not just attacks that were taking place and, oh, isn't that bad and all of that, but she was writing about how people organised communities of resistance against those attacks, how people came together. And that's really the kind of theme of tonight, was how we can stand up. What are the challenges in workplaces, and what are the challenges wider across communities, across the country? And that's why the first speaker that we're going to hear from tonight is the TUC's anti-racism lead, Michelle Codrington-Rogers, who I've known forever, basically. And Michelle, and I used to do this job. Obviously, I can't hold down jobs, so I've been doing loads of different things. But Michelle, who's already doing this job much better than I ever did, right, is looking at what is it that the trade union movement can do? What are the challenges that are facing us in workplaces? We're the NUJ after all, right? We've got to think about what happens in workplaces where we organise. But also, Michelle will be able to give us, I hope, a kind of wider view of the different challenges that unions are kind of dealing with, how they're standing up against the rise of the far right across this country. So can I ask you to welcome Michelle Codrington-Rogers?
You want me to stand here?
Stand where you like, mate.
Okay. I've set a timer because I'm an ex-teacher and I can talk. So I'm going to set a timer. Remember, shut me up if I'm going on too long.
Shut the teacher up.
Yes, always try. Thank you for that introduction, Roger. Roger is very good at asking me to do things last minute because he knows I don't say no. I owe Roger so much because before I'd done a number of my roles, I was at NUS and I was the first full-time black students officer. And that was very difficult as somebody who wasn't involved in formal politics to come in and to take that role on. And Roger was one of the grown-ups who explained to me how it works and how to look after yourself and how to prepare for when you're saying those difficult things. And that has stayed with me my whole time. So 20 years later, here I am doing the job that Roger used to do. And I can't get over the significance of that because I've had the opportunity to work with some fantastic people. But as a teacher, that's where I really found my voice. Because we're talking about the children and the young people. They look to us because we are able to demonstrate to them not just how the world is, but also how the world should be. And children are really scared at the moment. Really, really scared, especially black children. Just to kind of be a bit clear, I will use the TUC language, which is black, the political black. It's an inclusive term. I could also use the term global majority because as melanated people we're in the majority, some people don't quite like that. So I'm going to use the term black, okay? So I've come into this job, into this role on October the 1st. Complete baptism of fire, thrown straight in. But there is a huge challenge that we are facing. And it's quite easy in some aspects to say, well, the issue is the rise of the far right. And I'm going to talk about the issue of the rise of the far right and populism landing on our shores. But one thing I can say, especially in a room where it is family, we've been here before, and we've been here before, and we've been here before. I came into my political awareness during the rise of the British Nationalist Party. I was a youngster when it was National Front and it was Combat 18. Same people, same rhetoric, different faces. So I stand as the anti-racism officer which is absolutely fighting populism is my job as the anti-racist lead. But my job is also changing the systemic environment where white supremacy is allowing this to keep happening every 20 or so years. And it's almost cyclical. Our fight doesn't stop with the collapse of a far-right party like Reform or the British Nationalist Party. They just dissipate and become something else. And we're still left fighting the same fight that we need to fight so that those children that look up to us are able to walk into an environment where they're able to thrive. So absolutely, the fight against populism is our fight, but it's not our only fight. And the way fighting for rights works is it exhausts you. It exhausts you emotionally, it exhausts you financially, it exhausts you so that you're unable to do what it is that we need to do. As an activist, I burned out. Roger knows this. I burned out. And that was only doing the job for 2 years. I burned out. And there are so many activists out there who are now starting to say, we can keep fighting the far right. However, I need to know when I can step in and use my energy, because this is a universal fight. And the reason why it's different this time round is the far right are so much more organised. They've practiced. Some of those riots we had in the summer was them testing the field to see whether or not they would get support in those areas. And we're now seeing that those are the areas that have got the most support. Those are the areas where we're seeing Reform getting elected. Those are the areas where we're seeing people protesting outside hotels, because they know that we are tired. We're worn thin. And they are playing on a sense of disappointment, desperation, and fear. They have managed to introduce and to speak up and speak into reality wedge issues that are based on multiple fronts. It was easier in the 80s to say it is the black people and the migrants who are coming over, stealing our jobs, stealing our houses, stopping us from being able to survive. But now they've actually found a way to create complete disharmony in lots of different ways. So they're using violence against women and girls as their wedge issue to talk about women. These people do not care about women. And if you look at some of the high activists who are involved in organisations as set up by Yaxi Lennon, was I right?
Go with it.
He has people who are working with him who are convicted for violence against women and girls. They're saying it's about protecting Christian roots from the onslaught of Islam. Most of them don't go to church. They couldn't tell you who the leader of the Church of England is. They couldn't even tell you who the Pope is, because they're not the ones who are turning up at church even for a Sunday. Not even for Christmas. Not even for Easter. But they want to be the protectors of Christianity. They're protecting the idea of what it means to be a woman when it comes to LGBT rights by saying that trans people don't belong. They're demonising and they're causing division where they had already laid the breadcrumbs. When it comes to people with disabilities, well, we already heard what Trump said about autism. There's many of them out there. This is just a fake illness, a fake disease that's being created by the left so that some children can get away with what they get away with. It's not real. And we've already seen in one council where Reform managed to get power, where their SEND provision, their SEND provisions collapsed. They've withdrawn the budget. So in a system where we've already got children with disabilities already disadvantaged, they don't even know how to even start solving the problem of making sure that there is enough funding for those children. They are now attacking on multiple fronts. It's not just about race. Yet they used a dog whistle of migration. They used a dog whistle of look at some groups doing better than us as an excuse and as a reason. One of the things that we are also quite aware of, especially within the trade union movement, is that when you look across the people who are buying in to what the populists are doing at the moment, they are the same people we sit next to on the bus, the people we go to work with, the people who are dropping their children off at school the same time as us, the people who we walk past in Tesco's. And that's where the fear is kind of growing for us, for our communities, because they've become bolder. And at the flip of a switch, they will attack because they feel able to. But that didn't happen yesterday, and that didn't happen a week ago, and that didn't happen a month ago. This is all a symptom of these systems that we are trying to dismantle. And it's hard to do that on your own. But it's hard to do it even in our own workplaces. And so I kind of came here as a guest and ended up speaking. But I'm going to pick up on what Roger said. Because some people are saying, well, all we need is more unity. I'm going to disagree with you there, Roger. Because those people on those marches don't want to be called sexist. They don't want to be called misogynist. They don't want to be called disableist or homophobic. They don't want to be called racist. Because they've got black people in their families. They've got people they know who've got disabilities. They know women who are able to get the support that they need. They're just there campaigning for their one issue. And they've been managed to create a space where you have the football thug sitting next to the person who just wants more funding for special educational needs in their school. We've got the people who are drinking from 6 o'clock in the morning going to these marches, sat next to people who have a partner who is an ethnic minority or a migrant. This is where the fear comes. Because as some people say, they look like you and me. And what we're starting to see, and this is the bit that even is really hard for us as a movement to understand and to challenge, we see people who look like us are starting to buy into it. Now, my granny was a proud Conservative. Margaret Thatcher could do no wrong in her eyes. My dad voted for Brexit. He didn't want the migrants stealing his job. But now this populist approach is being seen as something that we can belong to. So if you look at the spokesperson for Reform, it's a man of Southeast Asian heritage. And it doesn't help when we have people in government who also look like us, who are stoking the fire, mainly on the other side of the aisle. So we need to make sure that we are able to create and have those conversations. We need to be challenging. We need to be thinking about how we can highlight their hypocrisy. But we've also got to be doing the work that's necessary to make sure that next time this happens, we're ready for it. And the trade union movement is struggling with that. And I'm not going to lie by standing here saying it's absolutely got it right. But what we do need to do is we need to be able to recognise that this is a multi-pronged attack, and we need to be approaching it and attacking it on multiple levels. And that means us working together in unity, but working separately when we can. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm really not sure why it's taken us so long to get around to somebody who, for me, is one of the best parliamentarians around at the moment. Somebody who's prepared to stand up and to say it like it is, but also somebody who's prepared to stand up for us as working class people, black and white, and somebody who's prepared to stand up for the values of, I can say it, that the Labour Party used to stand up for, but certainly something that the trade union movement still believes in and still wants to see happen. And that's why this lecture tonight is so important. But I am absolutely... I missed it? Right. I was supposed to keep pressing this thing, otherwise... Anyway. So I want you all to give a huge, huge welcome to the Member of Parliament for Clapham and Brixton Hill, which wasn't that Stretton, wasn't before? Anyway, Clapham and Brixton Hill. So this is where the energy thing comes back, right? Because I'm absolutely delighted that somebody who I regard as a great friend, but much more than that, a great parliamentarian, Bell Ribeiro-Addy.
Thank you very much, everybody. And it is a huge honour to be able to, well, actually to be even asked just to give a lecture like this, especially in the name of someone who is such a huge inspiration. And I think it's important that when we think about, I suppose, these memorial lectures and what we aim to do with them, it's not, I suppose, just about remembrance or remembering what an individual has done, like Claudia Jones, but kind of to reclaim her fire. Because for Claudia Jones in particular, because I don't believe she was just an activist, I actually think she was a force of nature. I think she looked at empire in the eye and she said, I can see through you. Now, I don't think too much needs to be said about her background, but I always think it's important to mention something. So she was born in Trinidad in 1915. And she journeyed to the United States as a child. She grew up, became a journalist, a radical activist, a communist, a feminist, a black nationalist. And she actually endured the burdens of class, race and gender, but she refused to accept their invisibility within the progressive movements of her time. And as one scholar once wrote about her, to be black and female under colonialism is to be doubly dispossessed. But from that dispossession, we build revolutionary strength. Now, her life seemed to be a series of battles. Some of them were public, some of them were unseen, imprisonment, deportation, hostility from institutions that actually feared the things that she was saying. And yet she never seemed to divert from the bigger horizon. Freedom, equality, international solidarity. She understood long before it was fashionable that the liberation of black women was the key to the liberation of everyone. And that's a point I'm going to keep coming back to. Now, she was a teacher and a strategist, and much like the mitochondrial Eve, the first black woman from whom all human beings descend, she provided a blueprint. She told the truth when it wasn't safe, and she organised when it wasn't popular, and she built movements from nothing. A newspaper, a carnival, a community, and out of sheer courage and conviction, she taught us that joy can be revolutionary, and that solidarity can be stronger than fear, and that resistance could be beautiful. And I think, as I said, that these memorial lectures are meant to be more about paying homage or the dronings of the person that gets to give the lecture. They have to be more. So I want us to ask ourselves, what does her voice demand of us now? Because the world that she was fighting to change still absolutely needs changing. And those two battles that I think defined her life, the fight for black women's leadership and the fight against imperialism and racism, remain the defining struggles of our time. Now, to quote Claudia herself, she said, we must end the practice in which many Negro women who join our party, leaders in their churches, communities and fraternal groups, suddenly find themselves viewed not as leaders, but as people who have to get their feet wet organisationally. And I think what she was trying to say here quite clearly was to stop treating black women like beginners in movements that we built and stop sidelining the experience that comes not from titles or CVs, because these are things that are usually gifted to us apparently, but from communities, from lived struggle and from organising every single day. And that kind of behaviour still happens today, no matter how many black women you may see in positions of power. Black women step into politics, into public life, into leadership, and too often they're met with suspicion, sidelined, or just plain silent hostility. Take it from someone who recently stood for the deputy leadership of her party. Now, competence as well is something that is always questioned, and their courage is taken for granted. So, black women are invited to the table and they already find that the menu is set and they should be grateful for this so-called seat. And Claudia warned us that the bourgeoisie fears the militancy of the Negro woman, and for good reason, because when black women move, the world moves. When black women lead, communities rise. And when black women speak, the mask slips from power. Diversity matters, but it was never meant to be the destination. It's meant to be the beginning. the beginning, almost leading into representation. I worry that too often people confuse diversity and representation. A few black spaces in high places mean nothing if those faces can't actually speak freely, challenge injustice, or shape policy. Or in the case of some of the black faces that we see in positions of power, are only there because they will say things that are not representative of the communities that they reflect. And that happens often. So symbolic inclusion isn't liberation, structural power has to be. And even within progressive spaces, black women are too often left out. Too often racial justice is treated as an optional add-on, a subcommittee issue or a slogan wheeled out during Black History Month, and that solidarity that excludes is not solidarity at all. Anti-racism often becomes a footnote, and that makes it not anti-racism. Anti-racism is something which is very, very active. And the way in which sometimes on the left, even if you challenge racism in a structure or even of an individual, the amount of times I've had thrown back at me that somebody couldn't possibly be racist because of a former black lover, a black family member, a black child, or because of that apartheid march that they went on, it just throws me every single time that you would think that these singular acts or other individuals that are not yourself automatically make you not racist. We have to understand that until the most marginalised are free, none of us are free. So I go back to that point that the liberation of black women is key to the liberation of everyone. And it's not abstract. I want to think about some contemporary examples in here. So in the UK, black women continue to be underrepresented in a variety of positions, but they're overrepresented in communities bearing the brunt of austerity, police brutality, underfunded public services. The dynamics that Claudia described, having to prove oneself constantly, being judged by rules that don't apply to others, are really alive in every single political party, in every civic organisation, in every activist space, and probably in here too. And I think another thing that Claudia taught us, which is really, really important, is that racism isn't simply individual prejudice. Over the years in particular, people have seemed to narrow it down to individual prejudice, and you see the way that the Tories attempted to do that with that awful Sewell report, just narrowing that all down to, sorry, let me switch this off because it looks terrible. Narrowing that all down to individual prejudice, but we have to be clear that racism is structural. And she said imperialism is the root cause of racism. It is the ideology which upholds colonial rule and exploitation. It is the ideology which breeds fascism, rightly condemned by civilized people of the whole world. Now, these words are not history, they're actually a warning, because the ideology Claudia described never went away, it simply changed its clothes. We like to pretend that the empire ended, but its logic is alive and well. So we think about trade deals that rob the global south, wars that continue to be fought for resources, and borders that are designed to keep wealth in and people out. Sweatshops. Offshore accounts hiding stolen wealth. Racism is the cement that holds it all together. You can't extract billions from Africa, the Caribbean, Asia, and the Americas for centuries without building a system to justify it. You can't enslave and colonize people without inventing a hierarchy of human worth. And once invented, that hierarchy seeps into every single structure, law, culture, education, economy. And we have to be absolutely clear about this, that it is racism that fuels capitalism. It keeps wages low, divides workers, blames the poor for poverty. It allows billionaires to maintain power by convincing some groups that others are the real enemy. I don't know if anybody's ever seen that meme. There's three men sat at the table and they've got cookies on their plates. You've got obviously a very rich white man in a suit, and he's got like a whole pile of cookies on his plate. You've got and two other clearly working class men. One is white, one is black. The black man has one cookie on his plate, and the white working class man has no cookies on his plate. And the rich man is pointing at the black man and saying to the other white man, he's taking all of your cookies. And when I think of that, when I think of how racism fuels capitalism and division, I think of that particular meme. Now, we have to understand the system doesn't actually just tolerate racism, it depends on it. It depends on it. And that, to me, is why reparations matter. And you ask why I bring it in now. It's because racism is structural and the remedy must be structural. And reparations are about repairing that structure. And people think that reparations are so far removed from anything that we should be doing. And that's because people view reparations again and again as just about money. But if you take it back to the root of the word, it is about repair. It's about repairing all of those systems that led to the situation that we have now. So we're talking about educational reparations, repairing the record, environmental reparations. We're talking about putting countries in positions that they should have been in had they not been plundered. All of these things, and they are not because quite simply. We're talking about a structural remedy and we haven't got to that part of repair. That's why we find ourselves in the situation we are now. And reparations are not about charity, it's about responsibility, restitution, redistribution, reconstruction, rebuilding communities that have been devastated by that extraction, and rebalancing the world order entirely. And thinking about redistributing wealth to those from whose labour and land it was stolen, and above all, restoring dignity. And people think it's so far removed because whenever we touch on that issue of money, people start to get down to, I suppose, the very element which fuels people in different countries hoarding wealth. The idea that if somebody else gets something, they themselves won't have it. So we live in this system where we feel repeatedly that in order to make sure that we maintain our living standards, we need to make sure that somebody has a worse living standards than our own. And I think that is a falsity that we have to continue to address. And actually, if we can find the resources to do things such as bail out banks, I don't understand why we couldn't pay for justice. And that brings me to why we are in the state that we are at the moment. Because instead of repair and instead of looking towards different situations where we can rebalance all of those inequalities globally, not just locally, we instead of that justice, we see a resurgence of those very same forces that Claudia Jones actually warned us about. Fascism in a new suit. Racism dressed up as patriotism, nationalism masking itself as taking back control, governments demonising migrants and tabloids continuing to target refugees, and politicians that are trading in culture wars, and that's those three things: divide, distract, and dominate. Now, this isn't new. The faces have changed, the language has shifted, but the playbook remains the same. And the far right continues to thrive on this despair and on our silence, and it depends on our inaction. It grows further and further when people don't call it out, and it grows when we allow these inequalities that it exploits, poverty, exclusion, and neglect to persist. It feeds on all of the discontent that are caused by structural injustices, and it turns its back on the most vulnerable: migrants, black communities, working class people. And instead of at times uniting, just like the meme I described, we find ourselves being pitted against each other, even in the course of something as simple as education. Now, we are in Black History Month, and I've been asked time and time again, when people are asking more and more for Black history to be taught in our schools, people getting upset and saying, well, why aren't we teaching a lot of our working class histories in schools? And I say, why aren't we teaching our working class histories in schools? That absolutely makes sense. Now, I didn't learn about the Bristol bus boycotts in schools, but I also didn't learn about the miners' strike. And I think about why I didn't learn about these different things is because we teach our children, or the education system teaches our children the things they want us to respect. We learnt a lot about kings and queens. Now, for me, it's interesting. I like a period drama, but we learnt about them so much because they wanted us to revere them and they wanted us to respect them. And whenever I think about why they left out some of these particular struggles, I think about what it was intended to do. And I think that if you were to teach children from black and working class communities, because all of these anti-racist struggles, in my view, were very much working class struggles. If you were to teach them about these struggles, that they could unite and fight and they could change things, you might actually teach them that they have, some sort of license to grow up, to change the world in which they live. And obviously, that would be a problem for the ruling classes. And so we have to be clear that the far right is not, and the ideology that they put out is not an isolated problem, it's a symptom. It's the product of imperial histories, of stolen wealth, of centuries of extraction, of a global capitalist system built on exploitation and lies. And Claudia knew this. She understood that racism doesn't begin with hate, it actually begins with profit. And it ends with power. And that's why she said imperialism is the root cause of racism. The far right is a modern manifestation of the same structures that built empire. It weaponizes fear to justify inequality. It's the ultimate distraction, and it thrives when we allow austerity to decimate our communities and economic crises are blamed on migrants instead of mismanagement. And it tells us that the people next door are the enemy, while the architects of injustice continue their work unchecked. And so I just say that by looking all around us and looking at the discourse in politics and in the press, especially given the building that we are in. Now, when we remain silent about these issues, we do give the far right more space to grow, or if we remain silent about any part of it. Now, I think about Roger touching on the riots that we've seen over this year and actually last year. And I think about the fact that people keep saying, not everybody that went on those protests are racist. And it's true, they may not all be racist, and they may, as I said, have touched on those particular issues in terms of inequality and poverty, and those may be the ones that have driven them to there. But we cannot deny the fact, as anti-racists, that these individuals thought it was acceptable to go on a march organised by racists. That's not okay. It's not okay at all, and it also shows us that in the face of these inequalities, some people are willing to pander to racism. So I don't think that we should be giving an inch in any way, or because ultimately what we would be saying then is that a little bit of racism is acceptable when people are upset about things, and stuff like that grows, that thrives, and that causes us so many problems. So it's not about polite disagreement. We have to recognise what is at stake, because the far right doesn't just divide, it completely destroys. It's destroying communities and trust and democracy, and it wants to make fear normal and hate acceptable, that very hate we're talking about. And I think it's important to think about how we go about resistance. We have to think about it more than the individual. We have to go deep, and we have to fight the system that creates the conditions for the far right to flourish. We have to fight inequality, exploitation, and the legacies of empire that still shape our society today. And that's why I go back to reparations. Reparative justice is part of that fight. Structural change is part of that fight. If we are going to change these issues, we have to go to the very root of the problem. And if we don't go about that repair, we're never going to get there. So we have to be deliberate. We have to connect the dots: austerity, racism, colonial history and economic inequality, exploitation abroad, neglect at home. Because when we don't, the far right actually fills the vacuum. And when we don't, hatred spread. And we have to understand that racism doesn't begin in people's hearts. It begins in systems, and it ends in power. So we have to recognise it's a global fight, and that the far right thrives wherever the fear of other can be weaponised. So from Europe, from the US, from our own communities to the international stage, it is the same logic again: divide, distract, and dominate. And solidarity is important, and I feel like sometimes we use that word very, very loosely. But I think more about the solidarity that Claudia fought for, the same solidarity that reminds us that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And even the most progressive of us, I genuinely don't believe that we always think that at times. We always think that sometimes solidarity is expendable, or we actually call for half measures. I call it the NGOization of the world, you know? Those very, very wet campaigning groups that are like, oh, if we just ask for this, you know, we have to be practical. We have to think about these things. We have to compromise. And sadly, the things that we always seem to be willing to compromise are matters of justice that directly impact the most disadvantaged in the world. And I think that's wrong. So what we have to do is speak loudly, clearly, fearlessly, calling out hate wherever it hides, act, organise, build communities, and ultimately, again, it comes back to demanding structural solutions. Again, the reparations, investment in communities, equitable distribution of resources and policies that actually dismantle the hierarchies created by centuries of imperialism. And we have to remember that the far right is not only a threat to the vulnerable, it's a threat to democracy itself, and it wants to make this division normal, and we can't accept that. And we can't afford those half measures. We can't afford those token gestures because the far right is actually thriving in those different gaps. Those gaps in education, the gaps in opportunity, the gaps in justice. And every time we fail to fill any one of those gaps, we leave room for fear to take hold. And every time we fail to act, we are complicit. And it's important to understand that courage is required. And that's why I suppose sometimes not calling for some of these things is a problem, because when we seek to compromise on some of the most fundamental things, when we talk about rights, we continue to do a huge disservice. You know, we have to have the courage to insist on justice in the face of institutional complacency. And that may mean, for somebody like myself, calling for reparations while people keep telling me that I'm ridiculous, because I understand that there is a root cause to all of these problems. And if we don't tackle the root, we are never going to get to a place where things change. So the stakes couldn't be higher. The far right doesn't simply seek political power, it's seeking to actually redefine what's normal. And that is a huge problem. So we have to be very, very clear that we can't allow fear to dictate policy, or hatred to dictate our culture, or exclusion to actually dictate the level of opportunity that people are allowed. And we have to make sure that solidarity, that real solidarity that doesn't leave people by the wayside, saying, well, if we get, and I've heard things like this before, well, if we make these gains for some women now, we'll make gains for the other women later. That kind of fake solidarity. You have to make sure that real solidarity is more contagious than fear. And I think back to what Claudia Jones taught us about oppression being interconnected, that intersectionality, and that racism and imperialism are inseparable. And that means that liberation has to be too. And that means the fight about the far right is not just about resisting it, it's about building an entire alternative. An alternative that's not just inclusive and rooted in structural equality, an alternative where black women, working class communities and migrants and all of those historically excluded are not bargaining for inclusion, they're actually leading. And that takes me back to that point again, that the liberation of black women is essential to the liberation of everyone. Now, I'm going back to that quote again that Claudia wrote about the bourgeoisie being fearful of the militancy of the Negro woman. And she says it's for good reason. She said, because the capitalists know that once Negro women undertake action, the militancy of the whole Negro people and thus the anti-imperialist coalition is greatly enhanced. So we have to understand that black women are not just another demographic slice. They are a strategic pivot, because when they are excluded, movements lose legitimacy, energy, and reach. And they lose all of these things because when we think about it, black women, or some people will call them women of colour, make up the majority of the entire world. And doesn't anybody think that it's strange that the most overrepresented group in the entire world is the one that is trodden on the most, the one that faces the most inequalities, and the one that faces, I suppose, the most injustice? So when black women are included fully, something shifts. Movements become broader and deeper and more resilient. But again, I point to this issue of not just diversity, because it cannot just be diversity without structural power, because that is completely empty. We're talking that would be like policy influence without agency, which is tokenism, or leadership without accountability to communities, and that is just decoration. And unfortunately, I see that in my profession all the time. So, if this idea that we have of democracy is going to thrive, the leadership of black women globally mustn't only be present; it has to be respected, it has to be empowered, and it has to be embedded in the infrastructure. Now, Claudia's insistence that anti-racism, anti-imperialism were inseparable is, again, coming back to the point of reparations, why it has to be central, because racism is rooted in stolen land, stolen labour, stolen lives, and the remedy can't be symbolic. It has to include material transformation. It must include complete material transformation. So that means not celebrating a few symbolic victories, as we often have. And I'm not saying it's not important for the first black person here or the first black person there. I think those things are very, very key for diversity. But sometimes when we hail those things up, or when we hail small victories that perhaps not even just an individual but a nation may achieve, then we seem to forget the liberation of others, because having, as I said, a black face in a space or a country achieve a certain milestone doesn't necessarily mean that all of those that are most impoverished or most impacted by inequality are actually going to gain anything from it. And I think in that way that Claudia's analysis remains almost prophetic. The empire may have formally ended, but its logic very much persists. And it very much persists in the way in which it pits different groups against each other, in the way in which it holds certain communities down. And we have to remember that imperialism breeds fascism and racism fuels capitalism. Without addressing the structural inequality, without the material redress, we're left with these half measures. And another thing that I believe that Claudia very much taught was that we have to think locally, yes, but globally, because justice cannot pick up on one axis of oppression. It can't pick one over the other. Anti-imperialism, anti-racism, feminism, none of these things are separate. They're completely intertwined. So it's about rebuilding, reclaiming, restructuring, and going back to my first point, we have to put black women at the centre of power. Because when we do that, we dismantle economic and political systems that reproduce this inequality, and we do this by going about the act of complete repair, by making sure that those who actually make up the majority of the world are central to the change that is happening and actually benefiting from any measures that are moving beyond inequality. And if there's anything I would say, sorry, it's completely gone off now, but I'm going to close soon, is that we need to make sure that we are tackling tokenism. Tackling tokenism in terms of representation, exposing the far right's lies, and resisting the normalisation of structural racism, because it feels to me that at the moment all of these things are becoming part and parcel just because we may have a few black faces in spaces. And actually just touching, as I come to a close, on Michelle's point earlier about burnout. And the phrase that we often hear, that the struggle is real. Yes, indeed, the struggle is very much real, but the struggle isn't life. So one of the last things that I think that Claudia taught us, which is so important, is that joy can be resistance, and by doing that, I think that's what she intended when she created Carnival, because Carnival was a very radical act. Yes, to those of you that have been to Carnival in the past few years, you have a great time, don't you? But it's that joy as defiance, and that type of culture as resistance. And it reminds us that struggle doesn't have to mean complete despair, and resistance doesn't require the negation of humanity. Our celebrations, music, art, culture, these are all powerful acts of liberation. And when we build joy, we build power. When we honour our heritage and we're claiming that space, and we resist that erasure of our culture and communities. So I think, again, going back to that going back to that point that I keep repeating about the liberation of black women and the importance of the militancy of black women, I think that Claudia's message has to be absolutely clear. And it has to be clear in the way in which she framed black women's leadership in things. And I think it's because she was a globalist, she was an internationalist, and again, she understood who the world was made up of, who was being trodden on the most. And actually, in all inequalities, if you lift up those who are at the very bottom, you make things better for absolutely everyone. And for some reason, this world has chosen the black woman for that particular burden. So we have a duty to act boldly and to think about this whenever we think about liberation movements. And actually we have a duty not to keep fighting for a seat at the table, because it's clear that the table is the problem in itself. We have to fight for a new table altogether. And again, just that point, Claudia taught us that when black women rise, the whole world rises. So if there is anything that you should think about in your activism, it's about how you are lifting up a black woman, because when you lift up a black woman, you are lifting up the rest of the world. Thank you.